Japan didn't lose a factory, it lost a calendar. The shipments were approved, the ports were open, the contracts were valid, but the magnets never arrived. Inside Japan's auto plants, production planners stopped scheduling weeks ahead and started counting hours. In Tokyo, officials realized the sanctions they signed weren't being challenged, they were being absorbed. And somewhere far from the cameras, a licensing delay turned into a leverage point no ally could offset and no policy could reverse quickly. Nothing collapsed, nothing was broken. But the system stopped moving on Japan's timeline, and once time becomes the weapon, the outcome is already decided. There was no announcement from Beijing, no retaliation headline, licenses simply slowed, exporters asked new questions, paperwork that once took days began stretching into weeks. Reuters reported that multiple Chinese suppliers described the approvals as more demanding even before formal rule changes were published. Japan learned the shift not from policy memos, but from empty pallets. That silence mattered because it wasn't improvised. Beijing had already been tightening its grip on the minerals and magnets embedded inside electric vehicle motors, factory robots, wind turbines, and missile guidance systems. In October, China formally expanded rare earth export controls, adding new processing steps and technologies to its control list. But honestly, the practical tightening came first. Chinese customs data, cited by Reuters, showed rare earth exports falling by about 31% in September from August. Magnet shipments actually reversed a 3-month climb, so the numbers moved before the law caught up. Why this matters is, well, mechanical. Export controls don't need to block trade to bend it. When processing is concentrated, friction compounds faster than policy can react. Factories felt the pressure before ministries did. In Shizuoka, Suzuki Motor halted production of its Swift model for 2 separate 2-week periods in late May and mid-June. Reuters cited sources linking the stoppages directly to shortages caused by China's rare earth restrictions. Output resumed only after parts began flowing again, a reminder that a single motor component can idle an entire assembly line. The data behind that stoppage was, honestly, stark. China's shipments of rare earth magnets fell roughly 50% month-on-month in May and were down nearly 75% year-over-year, according to customs figures tracked by Reuters, the sharpest contraction in records going back to at least 2012. Automakers and electronics firms triaged inventories, prioritizing critical lines and delaying everything else. Then, licenses were granted over the summer. Flows resumed. Schedules snapped back. A single approval cycle proved capable of whipsawing production across continents. This wasn't collateral damage. It was calibration. Tokyo's response unfolded under political pressure. After a turbulent summer, the Diet elected Sanae Takaichi as prime minister in late October. Her government immediately framed an industrial strategy centered on semiconductors, artificial intelligence, aerospace, shipbuilding, and defense, sectors where component failure cascades quickly. Days later, Finance Minister Katsunobu Kato publicly warned of supply security risks posed by China's latest rare earth curbs and urged coordination among G7 partners, according to remarks carried by Reuters. Diplomacy followed urgency. By late October, Japan and the United States signed a framework covering next-generation nuclear power and rare earth cooperation, positioning it as a pathway to reduce reliance on any single processor for materials essential to vehicles, electronics, and defense systems. The message was directional. The supply math was immediate. China still dominates the chain. Reuters cited consultancy estimates place China at roughly 70% of global rare earth mining, about 85% of refining, and nearly 90% of magnet and alloy production. CRU Group's analysis, also reported by Reuters, estimates China supplies about 90% of the world's rare earth magnets outright. That dominance runs from ore to motor. Inside Japan's trading houses, strategy turned dual track. Sojitz announced it had begun importing heavy rare earths mined by Australia's Lynas and processed in Malaysia, explicitly marketing the stream as non-China supply for advanced applications. But the same procurement teams continued filing license requests with Chinese counterparts because certain dysprosium-bearing inputs and magnet grades remained accessible only through Chinese processing routes. Hedging did not replace dependence. It revealed it. That pattern repeated across the market. When Beijing tightened approvals again in October, shipments sagged despite licenses granted earlier in the summer. Companies reopened contact books, knowing approvals could soften or harden without notice. This matters because of chemistry, not geology. Separation and alloying, not mining, determine leverage. The magnet story bleeds directly into chips. When Japan broadened its end-user controls in September, officials framed the list as preventing sensitive goods from reaching weapons programs. Beijing interpreted the move as escalation and said so publicly. Industry readouts captured the next layer of risk. Japanese toolmakers already faced restrictions on servicing and supplying Chinese fabs. Further tightening threatened maintenance windows and delayed upgrades, risks that translate directly into future revenue. That risk surfaced in guidance. Tokyo Electron linked export controls to weaker profit outlooks in its most recent forecasts, even as it highlighted robust demand tied to artificial intelligence investment, according to Bloomberg and Reuters coverage earlier this month. Growth existed, access constrained it. On Beijing's side, the decisive instrument was rare earth licensing. The Ministry of Commerce tightened the regime in the spring. Magnet exports dropped to pandemic-era lows in May. Partial easing tied to U.S.-China engagement restored some flow by midsummer. Then October's expansion retightened the valve. Analysts warned the new rules extended to foreign producers using Chinese materials or equipment, widening Beijing's reach across global supply chains, as reported by Reuters. That reach is not theoretical. High-performance magnets require precise dysprosium and terbium content to maintain coercivity at elevated temperatures. Licensing delays turn into overtime shifts, redesigns, or fewer finished vehicles. Engineers can optimize designs. They cannot substitute chemistry on demand. Tokyo sees the exposure and is trying to widen exits. Japan Oil, Gas and Metals National Corporation continues underwriting upstream investments and offtake agreements. The Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry is building bilateral critical minerals partnerships. The government is promoting scrap recovery and magnet recycling to reduce primary demand. These programs are documented across official releases this year. They matter. They also take time. Partners complicate the equation. In June, India sought to halt rare earth exports to Japan from its state miner to conserve domestic supply, according to Reuters, constricting one of the non-Chinese channels Japanese buyers had cultivated. Alternative suppliers often share the same processing choke points. Across the Sea of Japan, Beijing tracked leverage precisely. Reuters documented how magnet shipments rose through August after some exporters received licenses, then slipped again in September as approvals tightened, movements that aligned closely with diplomatic calendars. When United States guidance on general licenses emerged in Washington late last week, Brussels signaled it was seeking similar treatment. Even major blocs negotiate throughput. Back in Tokyo, semiconductor security continued to dominate headlines. Reuters reported in September that Beijing urged Japan to reverse its pattern of adding Chinese firms to the end-user list, while Tokyo emphasized non-discrimination and weapons risk criteria. Earlier Financial Times reporting captured deep industry anxiety over Chinese controls on chip materials, a prelude to the autumn's tightening cycle. Those concerns now echo across earnings calls. The automotive sector learned the lesson early. Suzuki's stoppage was brief, but it exposed how fast an input pinch can ripple through output. Reuters commodity analysts summarized the risk in April. China holds a vice-like grip on rare earth magnets, and magnets themselves sit on the control list. When September data showed shipments easing again, analysts at the Economist Intelligence Unit said the timing signaled intent, not accident. Japan's export controls can protect national security objectives while still depending on Chinese origin inputs to sustain the same industrial base. And the strategic connector here is that restricting what leaves does not guarantee access to what enters. Inside ministries, policy split into horizons. Long-term capital flowed toward non-Chinese streams through United States-Japan frameworks and allied financing. Meanwhile, short-term triage focused on licensing diplomacy and inventory management. Chinese exporters told Reuters it became increasingly difficult to secure new licenses in September. October's rule expansion formalized the slowdown. Bloomberg and Reuters chronicled Tokyo Electron's balancing act throughout the autumn, AI-era demand accelerating on one side, export control drag on service and tools to China on the other. Financial Times reporting earlier this year traced how Tokyo weighed risk as Beijing signaled tightening on chip materials. The September list expansion confirmed that this cadence, periodic escalation, selective easing, had become structural. The numbers keep forcing the same conclusion. Data cited across multiple Reuters analyses this autumn show China produces more than 90% of processed rare earths and rare earth magnets. That single fact explains why European officials are negotiating for general licenses and why Japanese buyers, even while signing deals with allies, still queue for Chinese approvals. Policy followed structure. In early November, Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi launched an economic strategy headquarters to channel public investment into semiconductors, defense, and other sectors exposed to input choke points, directing ministers to build public-private roadmaps for each designated industry. Analysts interpreted the move as an attempt to accelerate domestic capacity while coordinating industrial subsidies at a moment when supply risk had turned operational. A month of dispatches, customs tables, and factory notices converge on one reality. Japan expanded its end-user list to defend export control norms. China tightened rare earth licensing to defend leverage embedded in chemistry and processing. If output is measured in units, Sojitsu's Australian-Malaysian stream registers as a hedge. If output is measured in hours, Suzuki's halted line reads as a warning. The unresolved question sits where policy meets physics. The United States and Japan will invest in non-Chinese supply. Europe is negotiating for licenses. Equipment makers are threading compliance needles. And licensing officers in Beijing can still accelerate or slow approvals that determine whether dysprosium reaches a traction motor in Tahara next week. Japan can diversify contracts, but when a high coercivity magnet depends on Chinese processing and a stamp issued in Beijing, the order book answers a simpler question than geopolitics. Whose signature releases the cargo today? Please like and subscribe. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your support is appreciated. Thank you.